there is a very specific kind of heartbreak that only shows up when someone spends years being brilliant in secret, and nobody claps for it, nobody even notices it, and the person they're doing it for treats them like part of the furniture. That is the engine running underneath every single frame of El Gran Poderoso Genio. And if you've already seen the trailers and think this is a cute fantasy rom-com about a hot genie who falls for his wife, I need you to sit down, because this 2026 release is so much colder, so much sharper, and so much more emotionally brutal than its marketing let on. I'm genuinely still thinking about it days later, and that almost never happens to me anymore with romance dramas, because I've seen every trick in the genre's very tired playbook. Welcome back to Jonota News. If you are new here, this is exactly where you want to be for a deep, honest, no-nonsense breakdown of dramas that actually deserve the conversation, and if you've been here a while, you already know I don't do shallow recaps, I do full autopsies, so buckle in. Quick heads up before we go further, this is a full spoiler breakdown, meaning I am going to talk about the ending, the twists, the reveal about the lamp, all of it, so if you haven't finished the show yet and you want to go in completely blind, pause me now, go watch it, and come back, because trust me, this is one of those rare 2026 dramas where the ending recontextualizes literally everything that came before it. And I don't want to rob you of that gut punch if you haven't experienced it firsthand yet. Everyone else, let's get into it, because there is a lot to unpack. The premise sounds almost like a fairy tale someone told you as a kid and half remembered wrong. Elijah Baran is a genie. Not a genie in the cutesy, blue smoke, comic relief sense. He is thousands of years old, bound to a lamp, forced by an ancient curse to grant 3 wishes to whoever holds it, and then passed along, master after master, generation after generation, century after century, never aging, never dying, never truly choosing anything for himself. And here's the detail that the show plants early and then lets sit there quietly until it detonates in the back half. Elijah was not always a genie. He was a man once, a healer and scholar in a fictional ancient kingdom the show calls Castia, a place of dust-colored stone temples and river markets, and he was cursed into the lamp by a woman he refused to love, a sorceress whose pride could not survive rejection. That single act of him choosing not to lie about his heart, ironically, is what stripped him of the right to ever fully choose anything again. Sit with that for a second, because the show wants you to. The punishment for one honest no was thousands of years of being forced to say yes to strangers. By the time we meet him in the present day, Elijah has already granted wishes to soldiers, kings, thieves, grieving mothers, one particularly unhinged Renaissance-era art dealer, and finally, in the modern timeline, to a dying billionaire named Dominic Was. And this is where the show does something I genuinely did not expect from the marketing, because Dominic is not some cartoonish rich old man barking orders. He's introduced to us as tired. Not villain tired, not twist tired, just human tired, the specific exhaustion of a man who built an empire and lost almost everyone he loved along the way, and who is now staring down the last months of his life trying to figure out what to do with the one supernatural favor he's been sitting on for decades. Here's the mini scene that I think tells you everything you need to know about how this show operates, and honestly it's one of the best directed sequences in the entire run. It's late at night in Dominic's study, all warm low lamplight except for one cold blue monitor glow reflecting off his glasses, rain hammering the window in that soft insistent way that never quite becomes a storm. He pulls the lamp out of a locked drawer, and the show doesn't do a big magical flourish, it does the opposite, it goes almost dead silent, just the sound of his own breathing and the click of the drawer, and when Elijah appears he doesn't burst out in smoke and thunder, he simply is there, sitting in the chair across from Dominic like he'd been there the whole time, dressed exactly the way Dominic is dressed, an old, quite visual joke about mirroring that the show will pay off again much later. Dominic doesn't ask for money. He doesn't ask for more life, though God knows he could have. He asks, very simply, for his granddaughter to be protected after he's gone. And then he does the thing that makes this whole story possible, he attaches a condition to that wish that has nothing to do with business and everything to do with a desperate old man's last gamble on love. Marry her. 5 years. Stay. I want to pause on how uncomfortable that premise is on paper, because I think a weaker show would have played it for cuteness and never interrogated it, and this show absolutely interrogates it. Christine never consents to this. She is handed a husband the way you'd be handed a merger agreement, and for the first several episodes, the show lets that discomfort breathe instead of rushing past it, which I deeply respected. Elijah himself even pushes back on Dominic in that study scene, voice low, almost amused in that ancient, weary way, saying something like, "You want me to spend the only 5 years of true freedom I will ever know pretending to love a woman who has no idea what I am?" And Dominic's answer is the thesis of the entire show: "I'm not asking you to pretend." Elijah takes the wish anyway, because after thousands of years of servitude, even a conditional freedom is still the first real choice he's ever been offered, and the show is smart enough to make that choice feel earned rather than convenient. His transformation into a fully human man is genuinely one of the most quietly devastating stretches of the early episodes, because it's not filmed like a triumphant makeover montage, it's filmed like a slow horror of sensation. He feels cold for the first time in centuries and doesn't know what to do with his own shivering. He gets hungry and doesn't recognize the feeling, just sits there confused and a little afraid until a hotel concierge asks if he's all right. There's this gorgeous, aching shot of him standing in a bathroom at 3 in the morning just staring at his own reflection, touching his face like it's a mask that might come off, and the lighting design in that scene, all sickly fluorescent white against his stunned expression, does more emotional work than 3 pages of dialogue could have. And then he meets Christine. Let's talk about Christine Voss for a minute, because she is, without question, the character this show lives or dies on, and I think she's going to be divisive, and honestly, I think that's intentional. Christine is 29, brilliant, and armored to the teeth. Her parents died when she was a child, in an accident the show handles with real restraint, no melodrama, just a single devastating flashback of her as a little girl standing at a funeral in a coat too big for her, gripping her grandfather's hand so hard her knuckles are white while nobody around her makes eye contact with her grief. She was raised inside Voss Holdings, not inside a home. Dominic loved her, genuinely, but he loved her the way he loved the company, with strategy and long-term planning and an inability to just sit on the floor with a crying child. So Christine grew up believing that love is a liability, that softness gets exploited, that the only currency that matters is competence, and by the time this arranged marriage gets sprung on her, she has already decided, long before Elijah walks through the door, that whoever this husband is, he is a corporate inconvenience she will tolerate and nothing more. And here's where I have to give you my one slightly against the grain opinion on this show, because I've seen a lot of viewers online calling Christine unlikable in the early episodes, almost irredeemably cold, and I actually think that's the point being missed. I don't think the show wants you to like her early on. I think it wants you to recognize her. If you've ever watched someone build an entire personality out of self-protection because being open once cost them everything, Christine's coldness isn't a flaw in the writing, it's the writing working exactly as intended. She's not a mean girl. She's a woman doing long division with her own emotions because feeling things without a formula terrifies her. That doesn't excuse how she treats Elijah, and the show never lets her off the hook for it either, but it does explain it, and there's a difference between explaining cruelty and excusing it that this script understands better than most. Because make no mistake, she is cruel to him. Not in loud, dramatic, slap-across-the-face ways, though there is one unforgettable dinner scene we'll get to later that had me actually gasping out loud alone in my apartment. Her cruelty is quieter and, honestly, more realistic, which makes it worse. She doesn't learn his coffee order for the first 8 months. She introduces him at galas as, "my husband," in the exact tone you'd use to introduce a piece of furniture that came with the house. She schedules over their anniversary without blinking. She never once, not a single time in the first 3 years, asks him what his life was like before her, where he's from, what he wants, whether he's happy. To her, he is a fixture that came attached to a contract, and the show lingers on his face in these moments just long enough for you to feel every single one of those small erasures land. Meanwhile, and this is the gut-wrenching irony the entire series is built on, Elijah is quietly, relentlessly, spending every ounce of his remaining strange gifts building her career. Here's a piece of world-building I have to explain because the show is elegant about revealing it in pieces rather than dumping it all at once. When Elijah became fully human, he lost the ability to grant wishes, obviously, that's the whole deal, but the show implies, and later confirms, that a residue of what he was lingers in him like a scent that never quite washes out. He has an almost supernatural read on people, an instinct for truth and deception that borders on unsettling, a memory that holds thousands of years of watching human ambition rise and collapse, and he uses every bit of it, invisibly, in service of a woman who barely looks at him. He's the one who quietly redirects a nervous junior analyst toward the flaw in a competing bid that saves Was Holdings a fortune, and lets Christine take the credit in the boardroom without ever correcting the record. He's the one who, during her first major negotiation against her cousin Marcus for control of a key division, spends 3 sleepless nights reading through decades of shipping contracts because his centuries of pattern recognition catch an inconsistency no human analyst would think to look for, and he slips the information to her through an anonymous tip that she assumes came from a whistleblower inside the company. There's a sequence, one of my favorites in the whole first stretch, where Christine is up at 2 in the morning, drowning in printouts, genuinely panicking for maybe the only time we see her that raw, and Elijah comes in with tea, not saying a word about the folder he, coincidentally, leaves on the edge of her desk on his way out, the exact folder that turns out to contain the loophole that saves her deal. She thanks the tea. She doesn't even glance at him. The camera does, though. It holds on him a beat too long, watching her not see him, and if that shot doesn't make something twist in your chest, I genuinely don't know what to tell you. I'll be honest with you, that's the moment the show clicked for me as something more than a fun fantasy premise. Because up until then I was enjoying it the way you enjoy a well-made dessert, pleasant, a little frothy, nothing that's going to sit with you. But that shot, Elijah walking out of a room he just quietly saved, getting nothing, not even acknowledgement, made me feel something uncomfortably specific, something almost personal, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't think about every time I've done something invisible for somebody who never noticed. That's not melodrama, that's just me being honest with you about what this show managed to reach into. Let's talk performance for a second, because this material lives or dies on 2 actors carrying an enormous amount of internal contradiction, and both of them are doing genuinely excellent work, though in very different registers. The actor playing Elijah has this incredible ability to hold ancient exhaustion and boyish human wonder in the same face, sometimes in the same scene, sometimes in the same breath. Watch the way he handles small physical business, the way he picks up a fork like he's still cataloging what it's for, the way his shoulders carry a stillness that reads as centuries rather than posture coaching. It's a performance built entirely out of restraint, which is the hardest kind to pull off convincingly, because restraint that isn't grounded just reads as stiffness, and this never once reads as stiff, it reads as someone holding something enormous very carefully. The actress playing Christine has the tougher assignment honestly, because she has to make coldness compelling rather than repellent for 2+ seasons, and she pulls it off through her eyes more than anything else, this constant flicker of calculation and buried longing that she almost never lets surface into her voice. There's a technical trick she does that I noticed around the midpoint where her vocal register barely changes whether she's closing a $100 million deal or being genuinely wounded by something Elijah says, and at first I thought that was a limitation, and then I realized it's the entire character, that's Christine's whole tragedy in one acting choice. She has trained her voice never to give her away, even to herself. Now, let's slow down and actually sit inside year 3 of this marriage, because this is where the show stops being a slow burn and starts becoming something genuinely painful, and it's also where the direction gets noticeably more ambitious. There's an episode almost entirely built around a single rainy night, and I want to walk you through it because it's the emotional hinge the entire back half swings on. It's the anniversary of Christine's parents' death, a date she has spent her entire adult life pretending doesn't exist, burying herself in work every single year on that day like clockwork. This particular year, the board meeting she scheduled to distract herself gets cancelled last minute, and for the first time in over a decade, she has nowhere to hide from the date. Elijah finds her sitting on the floor of the penthouse, no lights on, storm outside throwing long silver streaks across the windows, a single half-finished glass of wine sweating on the coffee table beside her. He doesn't say anything grand. He just sits down on the floor next to her, not touching her, just present, and after a long, long silence, she finally tells him, in this flat, controlled voice that's clearly costing her everything to keep steady, about the coat that didn't fit at the funeral, about how nobody ever asked her what she needed because everyone assumed the richest orphan in the world couldn't possibly be in pain the same way as anyone else. And Elijah, ancient, strange, thousand-year-old Elijah, does the single most human thing he's done in the entire show up to that point. He just says, "I'm sorry nobody sat on the floor with you before now." That's it. No grand declaration. No magic. Just a man choosing to be present for someone in the exact wound-shaped space she never let anyone near. For one night, something genuinely shifts. She lets him hold her hand. She falls asleep against his shoulder, and the camera lingers on his face while she sleeps, this quite devastating mixture of hope and terror, because you can see in his expression that he knows exactly how much this will cost him if she wakes up and takes it back. She wakes up and takes it back. That's the gut punch the show is willing to deliver over and over again, and it's honestly one of the bravest choices in the writing, because a lesser show would have used that rainy night as the turning point where the couple slowly, steadily falls in love from there on out. This show refuses that comfort. Christine wakes up mortified by her own vulnerability, and instead of softening toward Elijah, she overcorrects hard in the opposite direction, becoming colder and more clipped with him than she'd been in months, as if punishing him for having witnessed her at her most unguarded. There's a scene the next morning at breakfast that is almost unbearable to watch, her sliding back into brisk business voice, asking him to move a dinner reservation like nothing happened, while he sits there processing the whiplash of having held her all night and now being treated like a scheduling assistant. It's such an accurate, unglamorous portrait of how people who are terrified of intimacy actually behave that I found myself wincing rather than swooning, and I mean that as the highest compliment. If you're the kind of viewer who wants steady, comforting forward momentum in a romance, I'll be straight with you, this show is going to frustrate you in the middle stretch, because it keeps giving you these small candlelit moments of connection and then yanking them away before they can calcify into something Christine has to admit is real. But if you're the kind of viewer who wants a story that respects how genuinely hard it is to unlearn a lifetime of self-protection, this is some of the most emotionally accurate writing I've seen in this genre in a long time, and I say that as someone who watches an embarrassing number of these shows for a living. Let's talk about the visual language for a minute, because the production clearly put real thought into how to distinguish Elijah's two states of existence without resorting to obvious gimmicks. Whenever the show flashes back to his genie centuries, the color grading shifts into these warm, saturated ambers and golds, the frame rate almost imperceptibly smoother, giving those sequences a dreamlike, slightly unreal quality, like memory rather than history. The modern Was Holdings world, by contrast, is all cool blues and hard reflective glass, sharp fluorescent boardroom lighting, the kind of sterile corporate beauty that looks expensive and feels lonely. And the penthouse where Elijah and Christine actually live sits visually in between the two, warmer than the office, colder than the past, which I think is a genuinely clever piece of unspoken visual storytelling, because that apartment is supposed to represent home, and for most of the show's runtime, it looks like neither of them fully believes it is one. The sound design deserves a specific shout-out too, particularly the way the show handles the lamp itself. Every time it appears on screen, there's this barely audible low hum underneath the score, almost below the threshold of conscious hearing, and it's mixed just loud enough that you feel a faint unease without necessarily clocking why. It's a small touch, but it does a lot of quiet work training your nervous system to associate the lamp with dread rather than wonder, which matters enormously for how the later reveal lands. And can we talk about the score for a second, because whoever composed this leaned into blending traditional Middle Eastern-inspired instrumentation, Audi, ney flute, hand percussion, with a fairly conventional modern string arrangement for the corporate drama beats, and the way those two musical languages slowly bleed into each other as the show progresses is honestly one of its most sophisticated storytelling choices. Early on, Elijah's ancient theme and Christine's corporate theme never overlap. They're musically separate worlds. By around the midpoint, in scenes where they're actually connecting, even briefly, you start hearing these tentative, fragile string lines that borrow phrasing from his ancient motif, like the show is literally scoring the two of them learning each other's language before either character consciously admits it's happening. I did not expect a fantasy corporate romance to have that level of compositional intentionality, and it elevated scenes that would have otherwise felt fairly standard. Now let's bring in the corporate plot properly, because this isn't just a two-hander chamber piece, there's a real external thread driving the stakes, and his name is Nathaniel Cross. Nathaniel is introduced early as a family friend, practically an honorary cousin, someone who grew up adjacent to the Voss family and has spent decades quietly resenting the fact that he was always treated as almost family, rather than actual family, always at the dinner table but never in the will. He's charming in that specific way villains in these shows always are, all warm handshakes and remembered birthdays, and the show is smart enough to let him be genuinely likable for a stretch before slowly revealing the calculation underneath. Nathaniel has spent years quietly accumulating shares in Voss Holdings through shell entities, waiting patiently for exactly the kind of instability that Dominic's death and a shaky marriage could provide. He's not a mustache-twirling villain, and honestly I think that restraint is one of the show's smarter choices, because his entire ideology is dressed up as reasonable business logic. He genuinely believes Christine is too emotionally erratic to run a company this size, and worse, he's not entirely wrong to worry, because for the first 2 years of her tenure she is running partly on borrowed brilliance she doesn't even know is borrowed. That's the ethical knot the show keeps tightening around Elijah's secret help. Every time he intervenes to save her from a mistake, he's protecting her, yes, but he's also quietly proving Nathaniel's underlying accusation falls through fraud rather than through her own unaided growth, and the show clearly knows this is a problem, because it keeps having Elijah wrestle with it in these small, private moments of doubt that never make it into dialogue with Christine, only into his own face when he's alone. There's a genuinely unsettling scene around the midpoint where Elijah, sitting alone on the penthouse balcony at night, essentially argues with himself out loud about whether what he's doing constitutes love or control, whether saving someone repeatedly without their knowledge or consent is protection or just another, gentler version of the same possession he escaped a lamp to get away from. It's a short scene, maybe 90 seconds, but it's doing some of the most sophisticated thematic work in the entire show, because it refuses to let Elijah be a simple romantic hero. He is, in his own quiet way, also someone struggling with the ethics of power, just expressed through devotion rather than domination. And then Dominic dies. I want to give this the space it deserves because the show absolutely does. It happens at the top of an episode with almost no warning, no long deathbed farewell tour, just a phone call that interrupts an ordinary morning, and the abruptness of it hits exactly the way real loss actually hits. Christine's reaction is the most emotionally unguarded we've seen her outside of that rainy night, and to the show's credit, it doesn't let Elijah's comfort magically fix anything this time. Grief isn't a wound he can quietly patch from the shadows. He tries, he's right there beside her at the funeral, steady, present, and she lets him be there physically, holds his arm, leans into him in front of the cameras and the board members and the vultures already circling, but the moment they're alone again, she pulls the armor right back on, almost violently, as if she's furious at herself for needing him publicly. Here's where the story quietly plants the seed that's going to detonate everything in the second half, and since we're doing full spoilers today, I'm going to tell you exactly what it is, though I'm going to let it breathe the way the show does rather than just blurting it out. Dominic leaves behind a locked vault, one Christine has never had access to, containing personal effects, and among them, wrapped in cloth that's clearly far older than anything else in that vault, is the lamp itself, along with a private journal in Dominic's own handwriting that was never meant to be read until after his death. Christine doesn't find it right away. The show is patient here, letting the corporate war with Nathaniel escalate first, letting Elijah's private doubts dip in, letting the marriage settle into its coldest, most exhausted rhythm yet as year 5 approaches. But that vault is sitting there the entire time like a lit fuse, and if you go back and rewatch the earlier episodes knowing it's there, you'll notice the show drops small, almost throwaway references to it, a lawyer mentioning an item excluded from the general estate inventory, a security log Christine glances at and dismisses, little breadcrumbs scattered with real precision. Meanwhile, Elijah is quietly falling apart in the most controlled, dignified way possible, which somehow makes it hit harder than if he were breaking down dramatically. Around year 4, there's a shareholder dinner, black tie, string quartet. The whole overproduced spectacle of wealth performing itself for itself, and Christine, cornered by a persistent gossip columnist asking pointed questions about the marriage, says, with a tight, practiced smile, introducing Elijah to a room full of people, "This is my husband. For now." she says it lightly, like a joke, the kind of self-deprecating deflection she's used 100 times to shut down uncomfortable questions, and everyone around her laughs politely and moves on, and the show lets the camera hold on Elijah for one merciless extra beat before cutting away, long enough to watch something in him quietly close like a door. That's the line. That's the moment I think most viewers point to as the true beginning of the end for this marriage, not because it's the cruelest thing she ever says to him, but because of the casualness of it, the fact that after everything, after years of his invisible devotion, she can still summarize their entire relationship as a temporary inconvenience for a laugh at a dinner party. And what makes it worse, what makes it almost unbearable, is that Elijah doesn't confront her about it. He doesn't even bring it up later. He just quietly starts making phone calls to a divorce attorney the following week, and the show frames this not as an impulsive wound reaction but as the final data point in a 5-year pattern he's finally, exhaustedly, allowed himself to fully believe. And this is exactly where I want to leave things for now, because what happens next, the vault, the journal, the confrontation, the reveal that recontextualizes literally every quiet sacrifice Elijah has made, and the brutal, beautiful mess of a final stretch this show puts both of these characters through, deserves its own proper telling rather than being rushed through at the tail end of an already long conversation. So let's sit inside that phone call to the divorce attorney for a second, because the show doesn't rush past it, and honestly, it shouldn't, because it's one of the quietest, saddest scenes in the entire first stretch of the series. Elijah makes the call from the rooftop garden of the WAS building, a space he'd actually built himself over the years, tucked away behind an HVAC unit where nobody from the executive floors ever bothers to go, full of plants he chose specifically because they reminded him of gardens from centuries he can barely stand to think about anymore. He's sitting on an overturned crate, phone pressed to his ear, and his voice is so level, so businesslike, that the attorney on the other end actually pauses and asks if he's sure, if he wants to take a few more days to think it over. And Elijah just says, very simply, I've had 5 years to think about it. I think I've actually had a few thousand. The line is delivered so quietly, almost thrown away, that you could miss how devastating it is if you are not paying attention, and I think that's deliberate, because Elijah has spent this entire show being the kind of person whose pain doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, silently, like sediment. What's fascinating structurally is that the show chooses not to tell Christine immediately. Elijah decides to wait until the actual 5-year mark, partly out of some old-fashioned sense of honoring the letter of the agreement he made with Dominic, and partly, I think, because some stubborn, exhausted part of him is still hoping something will happen in these last few months to prove him wrong. That's such a specifically human form of self-torture, isn't it, giving yourself a deadline for hope while already filling out the paperwork for its funeral? The show doesn't editorialize on this contradiction, it just lets Elijah live inside it, quietly reorganizing his life around an ending he hasn't announced yet, and there's something almost unbearably tender about watching a man methodically prepare to leave someone while still, in small ways, taking care of her. He still remembers her coffee order. He still leaves the anonymous folder on her desk when he catches something the board missed. He still shows up to the events she needs a husband-shaped presence at. He is, in every practical sense, still fully present in her life, right up until the day he's decided he won't be. Now, about that vault. I promised you full spoilers today, so let's actually walk through how Christine finds it, because the mechanics of the reveal are genuinely well constructed, not just dramatically convenient. It's Nathaniel, of all people, who indirectly triggers it. In his ongoing campaign to destabilize Christine's control of the company, he pushes through an audit of Dominic's full estate, framing it publicly as due diligence for shareholders concerned about the transition of power, but privately hoping to uncover something, anything, he can use to paint Christine as unprepared or the estate as improperly managed. It's a classic bit of villain irony that I appreciated, because his attempt to expose a weakness in Christine ends up handing her the single most important truth of her entire life, just not in the way he intended. The audit turns up the existence of a sealed subvault beneath the primary estate vault, one that even Dominic's own longtime lawyer, a grey, careful man named Feldman who has clearly known more than he's ever said for years, seems visibly uncomfortable about. there's a wonderful little moment where Feldman, standing beside Christine as the vault door finally grinds open after decades, mutters almost to himself, "He always said this would be for you and no one else," when the time was right, and you can see on Christine's face that she has no idea what this even refers to, because Dominic, true to form, loved her through structure and secrecy rather than conversation, right up until the literal end. Inside, alongside old photographs, a few pieces of jewelry that belonged to Christine's mother, and some yellowed corporate documents from the earliest days of Voss Holdings, there's the lamp, wrapped in dark cloth that looks almost ceremonial, clearly handled with more care than anything else in that vault, and beneath it, a leather journal with Dominic's handwriting on the cover, simply labeled with Christine's name and a date roughly 6 months before he died. The show lingers on her hands as she lifts the journal, this small tremor she can't quite control, because on some subconscious level, before she's even opened it, she already senses this is the one document in her grandfather's entire empire that was written not as strategy, but as confession. I have to be honest, the sequence of Christine reading that journal alone in her office at night is, for me, one of the best acted stretches of the entire show, because there is almost no dialogue, it's mostly just her face in tight, patient close-up as the lamplight from her desk flickers against her features, and you watch decades of assumptions about her own life quietly crumble in real time. Dominic's journal doesn't dance around anything. In full, unflinching detail, he writes about acquiring the lamp decades earlier from a dying antiques collector who begged him never to use it carelessly, about testing its authenticity almost as a joke and then spending years too afraid of what it might cost him to actually use his wishes, about eventually using his first 2 wishes for things the show only vaguely alludes to, business survival during a catastrophic downturn, and privately, quietly, the survival of Christine's mother through a difficult illness when Christine was still a toddler, a detail that recontextualizes an entire hidden decade of Voss family history that the show had only gestured at before. And then, in the journal's final pages, he writes about Elijah. Not as a genie, not as a magical solution, but as, in Dominic's own words, the only being I have ever met who has been alive long enough to actually know what love costs, and patient enough to still choose it anyway. Dominic writes, with a specificity that makes it clear he genuinely understood the ethical weight of what he was doing, that he knew tying Elijah's freedom to a 5-year marriage with his granddaughter was, in his own words, a cruelty dressed as a gift, but that he made the wish anyway because he had watched Christine build walls so tall and so precise that he genuinely believed only someone outside the normal rules of human patience could ever have a chance of reaching her before she calcified completely. He writes that he chose Elijah specifically, out of thousands of years of a genie having granted wishes to selfish, cruel, petty masters, because in their one late-night conversation, what struck him most wasn't Elijah's power, it was his loneliness, and Dominic, dying and desperate and out of good options, gambled that 2 profoundly lonely people locked together for 5 years might, against every rational expectation, actually save each other. It's such a beautifully constructed piece of dramatic irony that I want to just sit with it for a second, because up until this point in the show, we've been positioned to see this arranged marriage purely from Elijah's side, as a kind of extended prison sentence disguised as a gift, a condition slapped onto his freedom by a rich old man who didn't think twice about using other people's lives as leverage. And that reading isn't wrong, exactly. But the journal forces both Christine and the audience to reconsider Dominic not as a careless manipulator but as a grieving, guilty old man trying, in the clumsiest, most controlling way imaginable, the only language of love he'd ever actually learned, structure and strategy and long-term planning, to give his granddaughter the one thing his own parenting never could. Christine's reaction to all of this is where the show earns every bit of the emotional credit it's built up over 4 seasons of restraint. She doesn't cry immediately. She sits there, completely still, journal open on her lap, for what the show lets play out as an almost uncomfortably long silence, and when she finally does react, it's not tears, it's this small, disbelieving, slightly hysterical laugh, the kind that comes right before actual grief hits, because she's just realized that the man she has spent 5 years treating as a contractual inconvenience has secretly, invisibly, been the architect of nearly every professional triumph she's ever quietly taken credit for. And underneath that realization is an even more devastating one, that he never told her, never used it as leverage, never once made her feel indebted. He simply did it and then let her walk right past him afterward without a second glance, over and over again, for years. This is where the show finally, explicitly confirms something it had only been implying through visual storytelling up to this point, which is that Elijah's help wasn't limited to one or two lucky breaks. The journal, combined with a private conversation Christine has shortly after with Feldman, reveals the actual scope of it: the anonymous tip during the Marcus negotiation, a series of quietly corrected scheduling conflicts that saved her from disastrous public appearances during her most fragile early months as CEO, even the recruitment of 2 senior staff members who Christine believed she'd discovered herself through headhunters, but who had actually been gently steered toward was. Holdings by conversations Elijah had with them personally, conversations he never once mentioned to her. It's an overwhelming amount of information delivered efficiently and without melodrama, and the show trusts its audience enough not to spell out exactly how devastating this realization is. It just lets Christine's face do the work. Now here's where I have to give you the part of this story that genuinely made me put my hand over my mouth watching it live, because the show, instead of immediately cutting to a tearful confrontation and reconciliation, which is exactly what a lesser version of this story would have done, does something far more painful and far more honest. Christine finds out about the divorce papers before she gets the chance to say anything to Elijah about what she's learned. Feldman, in an act of misguided loyalty to procedure, informs her that Elijah's attorney has already filed preliminary paperwork, technically still within the 5-year window but clearly building toward an exit the moment that window closes, and Christine, reeling from the journal, from the guilt, from years of buried feelings suddenly surging up all at once, does the worst possible thing a person in that state can do. She confronts him with anger instead of vulnerability, because anger is the only emotional language she has ever fully trusted. There's a scene, and I have to walk you through this one properly because it's genuinely one of the best written confrontations I've seen in this genre in years, where Christine storms into Elijah's study that same night, journal in hand, and instead of saying anything close to "thank you," or "I'm sorry," or "I had no idea," what actually comes out of her mouth first is, "Why didn't you tell me?" delivered not with gratitude but with something closer to fury, because on some level, she experiences the discovery of his years of secret devotion not as a gift but as a kind of ambush, evidence that she has been living inside a version of her own life she didn't fully understand or consent to, controlled by kindness the same way she'd once been controlled by her grandfather's silence. And Elijah, standing there, journal recognized instantly across the room, finally lets himself be angry too, for what might be the first time in the entire show, and he says something along the lines of, "Would it have mattered? You barely looked at me when you thought I did nothing. Would knowing have made you see me, or would it just have given you one more thing to manage?" It's a brutal, fair, devastating question, and the show doesn't let either of them win it cleanly. Christine doesn't have a good answer, and to her credit, and to the writing's credit, she doesn't pretend to. She just stands there, journal clutched against her chest like armor that's failing her for the first time, and admits, quietly, that she doesn't know, that she's spent so long treating vulnerability as a weapon other people could use against her that she genuinely doesn't know how she would have responded to real, patient, undemanding devotion, because nobody had ever offered her that particular currency before and lived long enough, emotionally speaking, to see whether she'd have learned to accept it. And that's where I want to pause our walk through this story for now, because what happens in the space between that confrontation and the actual expiration of the 5-year agreement, the choices both of them make, the people who get pulled into the fallout, and the way the show ultimately resolves the ethical tangle of secret devotion versus honest consent, deserves the kind of careful, unhurried unpacking that I don't want to rush through just to wrap up a section. I do want to take a moment here, though, before we move forward chronologically, to talk about Nathaniel's arc more fully, because I skipped past some of his machinations to get to the emotional core of the marriage, and honestly, his storyline is doing more thematic work than I initially gave it credit for on a first watch. Nathaniel isn't just a corporate antagonist thrown in to manufacture stakes, he's a dark mirror for Elijah in a way the show only makes fully explicit very late in the run. Both men have spent years loving, or at least orbiting, the was family from a position of exclusion, always present, always useful, always slightly outside the actual bloodline of belonging. The difference, and this is the thing that elevates Nathaniel from a stock villain into something more interesting, is that where Elijah responded to exclusion with patient, almost self-erasing devotion, Nathaniel responded to the exact same wound with entitlement and resentment, deciding somewhere along the way that if he couldn't be loved by the Voss family, he would simply take what he believed he deserved instead. There's a scene between the two of them, actually, fairly late in the season, that I think a lot of viewers underrate on first watch, where Nathaniel, trying to recruit Elijah as an ally against Christine by appealing to what he assumes must be resentment at being sidelined and unappreciated, essentially says, "You've given that family everything and gotten nothing back. Don't you want them to finally understand what you are actually worth?" And Elijah's response is so quietly devastating in how thoroughly it dismantles Nathaniel's entire worldview. He just says, "I didn't do it so they would understand what I'm worth. I did it because I finally could." It's such a small line, but it's doing enormous thematic work, because it's the show articulating, through Elijah, the exact difference between love as generosity and love as a transaction waiting to be cashed in, which is precisely the distinction Nathaniel has never been able to make, and precisely the distinction Christine has spent her whole life terrified didn't actually exist in the real world. I think it's worth pausing on the performance choices here too, because the actor playing Nathaniel does something genuinely clever with the role. He never plays him as obviously villainous even in his most manipulative scenes. He plays him as a man who has rehearsed his own justifications so many times that he actually believes them, which is so much scarier and more realistic than a mustache-twirling schemer would have been. There's a specific tic he has, a habit of straightening his cufflinks right before he says something particularly self-serving, dressed up as reasonable concern, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. It becomes this quiet visual tell that the show uses almost like a magician's cue for the audience, a little signal that says, "Pay attention, here comes the manipulation dressed as care." Let's shift gears for a second and talk about some of the supporting cast, because while this show is unquestionably a two-hander at its emotional core, it wisely surrounds Elijah and Christine with a handful of secondary characters who do real work rather than just filling space. There's Priya, Christine's assistant turned genuine friend, who I think is one of the most quietly important characters in the entire show because she's the only person who seems to see Elijah clearly from very early on, who notices the pattern of small miracles happening around Christine's career long before the journal reveal forces everyone else to see it too. Priya never says anything outright, but there are these lovely little glances she gives Elijah across a room, a kind of silent solidarity, one person who does the invisible labor of keeping someone else's life running smoothly, recognizing another. In a show about being unseen, Priya is the person who sees, and I think that's a deliberate, generous choice by the writers, because it stops the narrative from implying that Elijah's devotion goes entirely unwitnessed by everyone, which would have tipped the whole thing into something closer to martyrdom porn rather than genuine tragedy. Then there's Marcus, Christine's cousin, who could have easily been reduced to a one-note corporate rival but gets a surprisingly sympathetic arc of his own, particularly once we learn that his aggressive push for control of the shipping division wasn't pure greed but partly an attempt to prove himself worthy of a family that has always treated him as the disappointing branch of the tree, the one who didn't inherit Dominic's ruthless brilliance and has spent his whole life compensating for it. His eventual reconciliation with Christine, born out of shared grief after Dominic's death rather than any grand dramatic gesture, is one of the quieter pleasures of the middle stretch of the show, a reminder that this family's dysfunction runs in multiple directions, not just through the central marriage plot. I also want to give credit to the way the show handles Elijah's occasional flashes of his old genie nature bleeding through his human life, because it would have been very easy for the writers to treat his transformation as total and clean, but instead they let it be messy and uneven in a way that feels true to the emotional logic of the story. There's a wonderful, strange little scene around the midpoint where Elijah, deeply frustrated after another dismissive interaction with Christine, snaps at a waiter who spills a drink on him, and his voice drops for just a fraction of a second into something older, something with an edge of ancient authority in it that makes the waiter visibly flinch and back away, and Elijah immediately catches himself, horrified, apologizing profusely, clearly disturbed by how easily the old power dynamic, master and servant, still lives somewhere inside him even though he no longer has any actual magic left. It's a small moment, but it does important work reminding us that becoming human isn't a costume change, it's an ongoing negotiation, and that Elijah is still, in some ways, unlearning thousands of years of being defined entirely by what he can do for other people rather than who he actually is. That theme, actually, of being valued only for utility rather than personhood, is really the connective tissue between every relationship in this show, and once you notice it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Elijah was a genie valued for wishes. Christine was raised to believe she was valuable to her grandfather primarily as an heir and an extension of the company. Nathaniel resents being valued as family friend rather than family. Even Marcus' whole arc is about proving his utility to a family that's only ever measured him by output. This is a show fundamentally about people trying to figure out whether they can ever be loved for existing rather than for producing, and I think that's a far richer, more universal theme than the fantasy rom-com marketing ever let on, which honestly makes me a little annoyed at whoever cut the trailers, because I think a lot of people who would have genuinely connected with this show probably scrolled right past it assuming it was fluffier than it actually is. I promised you earlier I'd circle back to that unforgettable dinner scene, the one that had me gasping out loud alone in my apartment, and I think this is the right moment to walk through it properly, because it sits right at the emotional midpoint of the series and it's honestly a masterclass in slow building, quite cruelty writing. It's a business dinner, one of those excruciating industry functions with assigned seating and forced small talk, and Christine has just closed a massive deal that Elijah, unbeknownst to her, spent the better part of 2 weeks quietly untangling behind the scenes after a shipping contingency threatened to blow the whole thing up days before signing. She's glowing, genuinely happy, the happiest we've seen her in the entire show up to that point, toasting with colleagues, accepting congratulations, and at some point, slightly buzzed on champagne and triumph, she turns to the table and, gesturing vaguely at Elijah beside her, says, with a light, careless little laugh, honestly, I don't know what he even does all day, but he's very decorative, isn't he? The table laughs. It's meant as a joke, the kind of thoughtless, throwaway line people say about their partners at parties without malice, without really thinking at all. But the camera holds on Elijah's face for just a beat too long, and you watch something in him go very, very still, the specific stillness of someone absorbing a wound they've decided not to let anyone see land, and then he does the thing that broke me, he smiles, raises his glass along with everyone else, and says nothing, plays along, lets the moment pass exactly like it's nothing, because objecting would mean admitting, in front of a room full of strangers, how much that offhand comment actually cost him. That's the scene. That's it. No shouting, no dramatic exit, just a man quietly swallowing an insult at a party because the alternative is being seen as needy or difficult, and I think it's more devastating than almost any argument in the entire show, because it's so recognizable, because most of us have either done that or had it done to us, and watching it happen to a character we've spent this much time inside the private interior of is genuinely gutting. I'll admit, watching that scene the first time, I actually paused the episode. I needed a minute. Not because it was shocking, but because it was so quietly, precisely accurate about a very specific kind of everyday emotional negligence that most romantic dramas don't even attempt to capture, because it's not cinematic in the traditional sense, there's no raised voices, no tears, just a joke that lands wrong and a person deciding to absorb it rather than make a scene. That's the moment I realized this show was operating on a different emotional frequency than most of its genre peers, and it's the scene I find myself thinking about most when people ask me why this drama has stuck with me the way it has. The days that follow that confrontation are some of the most quietly excruciating in the entire series, because the show refuses to let either of them retreat into anything as clean as a montage of sadness. Instead, we get the horrifying mundanity of two people who love each other, in some complicated, unspoken way, continuing to share a home while functionally becoming strangers again. Christine starts leaving earlier for work. Elijah starts staying later at the office he technically doesn't even need to occupy anymore, since his role in the company has always been informal, invisible, undocumented. They pass each other in hallways with the careful, overpolite distance of two people trying very hard not to start something they don't know how to finish. There's a shot, one of my favorites in the whole final stretch, of them both reaching for the same light switch in the kitchen at the exact same moment, hands almost touching, both immediately pulling back like they've been burned, and neither one says a word about it. That's the whole scene. No dialogue. Just two people who have spent 5 years occupying the same rooms finally, actually, seeing how much space has grown between them, and flinching from it. The 5-year mark itself arrives not with fanfare but with a lawyer's phone call, which feels exactly right for this story, because nothing in Christine and Elijah's relationship has ever been marked by the occasion you'd expect. There's no anniversary dinner, no dramatic countdown clock ticking down on screen. Instead, we get Feldman, grey and precise as ever, calling Christine's office to confirm that per the original terms Dominic laid out, today marks the technical conclusion of the arranged period, and that Mr. Burns' attorney has already submitted the finalized dissolution paperwork for her signature. I want to highlight how devastatingly bureaucratic the show makes this moment, because it would have been so easy to score this with swelling strings and slow motion, and instead we get fluorescent office lighting, the dry rustle of paper, and Christine sitting alone at her desk staring at a document that legally ends her marriage, phrased in the exact same clinical language you'd use to dissolve a business partnership. Which, in a sense, is exactly what it started as. She doesn't sign it immediately. The show gives us a full episode of her sitting with that unsigned document, carrying it in her bag to board meetings, leaving it on her nightstand, picking it up and putting it down, unable to commit either to signing it or destroying it, which I think is such an accurate portrait of grief that hasn't fully admitted its grief yet. Christine has spent her entire life being decisive, being the person in the room who makes the call everyone else is too afraid to make, and here she is, paralyzed by a single signature, because for the first time, the thing on the line isn't a company, it's the only person who's ever actually seen the parts of her she's spent 30 years hiding. And this is exactly the moment Nathaniel chooses to make his final move, because of course it is, because that's who he's been established to be for 4 seasons, a man who has never once missed an opportunity to exploit somebody else's vulnerability as a business opportunity. Word of the impending divorce leaks, and I want to be clear, the show implies fairly strongly that Nathaniel himself is the source of the leak, though it never gives us a smoking gun scene of him actually making the call, which I actually appreciate as a choice, because it keeps him in that grey area of plausible deniability that's been his signature move the entire show. Within days, financial press is running speculative pieces about instability at Was Holdings, about a CEO whose personal life is unraveling right as the company heads into a critical merger vote, and Nathaniel, positioning himself as the voice of shareholder concern rather than personal ambition, calls for an emergency board session to discuss what he delicately frames as leadership continuity. The board meeting that follows is, without question, the show's biggest set piece, and it earns every bit of the tension it builds. The room is packed, tension so thick you can practically hear it in the sound mix, this low, murmuring undercurrent of whispered conversation that the sound designers clearly worked hard to keep just below intelligible, so you feel the hostility of the room without being able to parse individual words, which mirrors Christine's own overwhelmed headspace perfectly. Nathaniel stands up first, immaculate, cufflinks straightened, and delivers what is honestly a chillingly effective speech, one that never once mentions the divorce directly but circles it constantly, talking about personal distraction, about the emotional toll of recent losses, about whether the board can, in good conscience, trust the company's most critical merger to a leader who, in his words, may not currently have the clarity of mind this moment demands. It's cruel, and it's also, infuriatingly, not entirely wrong, because Christine has been distracted, has been unraveling, just not in any way that actually threatens her competence, but Nathaniel doesn't need truth, he just needs doubt, and doubt is exactly what he's engineered. Here's where the show does something genuinely clever with its own premise, something that pays off the entire 5-year arc of secret help in a way that finally, properly resolves the ethical tension the writers have been building the whole time. Christine doesn't call on Elijah to save her. She doesn't lean on any hidden advantage. Instead, she stands up, and in a moment that the actress plays with this incredible controlled tremor, voice steady but hands visibly shaking at her sides, she does the one thing she has never once done in the entire run of the show. She tells the truth, all of it, in front of the board, in front of the shareholders, in front of the press quietly recording in the back row. She tells them about the marriage, about the arrangement, about her grandfather's wish. she tells them, unprompted, about the anonymous tips and quiet corrections she's only recently learned came from her own husband, framing it not as fraud or deception but as exactly what partnership actually looks like when nobody's watching. And then she says the line that I think is genuinely the thesis statement of the entire series. Delivered with her chin up, voice cracking just slightly at the edges, "You want to know if I'm distracted? I am. I'm distracted by finally understanding that the strongest thing I've ever done wasn't building this company alone. It was almost losing the one person who helped me build it and being too afraid to admit I needed him." It's a genuinely bold narrative swing, because instead of resolving the corporate plot through some clever last-minute business maneuver, the show resolves it through radical honesty, and I have to say, on a purely structural level, I think that's the correct choice, because this entire story has been about the corrosive cost of hiding, of Elijah hiding his devotion, of Christine hiding her fear, of Nathaniel hiding his resentment behind reasonable-sounding concern. Having the climax hinge on the one character finally refusing to hide anything feels earned rather than convenient, and it also, cleverly, removes Nathaniel's entire weapon, because you cannot destabilize someone with a secret they've just handed you willingly, stripped of shame, in front of the very room he was hoping to use it against her in. The vote doesn't go entirely Christine's way, I should say, because the show is smart enough not to give her a clean, total victory. She survives the no-confidence motion, but only barely, and Nathaniel walks away from that room having lost the battle but clearly not the war, his face in the final shot of that sequence doing this quiet, patient recalculation that tells you exactly what kind of season to set up is being planted, if this show gets one, which, based on the ending we'll actually be talking about, I genuinely hope it does. But the immediate crisis is resolved, the merger survives, Christine keeps her seat, and none of it required Elijah's intervention, secret or otherwise, which is, I think, precisely the point. The show needed to prove, definitively, on screen, in front of witnesses, that Christine was as fully capable on her own merit, not to erase Elijah's years of help, but to finally separate the question of her competence from the question of her heart, because those two things had been dangerously tangled together for the entire runtime, and until they're untangled, neither she nor the audience can trust what she feels for him as anything other than gratitude or dependency. Which brings us to the scene I've genuinely been waiting to talk about this entire review, the scene that I think justifies the show's entire slow, patient, occasionally frustrating build, the scene the marketing team should have been putting front and center instead of whatever glossy fantasy romance nonsense they cut the trailer around. It's raining again, deliberately, unmistakably echoing that earlier night on the penthouse floor, and the show wants you to notice the parallel. It even reuses a near-identical shot composition, rain streaking silver down floor-to-ceiling windows, low warm interior light against cold blue exterior dark. Elijah is packing. Not dramatically, not with slammed drawers or thrown belongings, just quietly, methodically, folding shirts into a suitcase on the bed they've shared, technically, for 5 years, and functionally shared real intimacy with maybe a dozen times total. Christine stands in the doorway for a long moment before she says anything, and the show holds on her face in this unbroken take, no cuts, just watching her work up the nerve, and when she finally speaks, it's not a grand declaration, it's almost apologetic in its smallness. She says, "You don't have to go tonight." And Elijah, without looking up from his folding, says, "I know I don't have to. I think I need to." That distinction, have to versus need to, is doing enormous work in this scene, because it's the show acknowledging, through Elijah's own voice, that this was never actually about the 5-year contract. The contract expired the moment he could have simply walked without consequence. This is about him needing to prove to himself, after thousands of years of never being allowed to choose anything, that he's capable of choosing to leave something that's hurting him, rather than just enduring it indefinitely, because that's the only mode he's ever known. Christine crosses the room then, and this is the moment, I think, where the actress does the best work of her entire run, because she doesn't cry immediately, she holds it, visibly holds it, the way Christine has held everything her entire life, and instead of grand romantic words, what actually comes out of her is almost clinical in its honesty. She says something like, "I've been running the numbers on this for 5 years, Elijah. Every kindness, every folder on my desk, every time you showed up somewhere I needed you and I acted like it was nothing. I kept telling myself it didn't count because I didn't ask for it. But I think I was just afraid that if I actually looked at it, added it all up, I'd have to admit what it actually was. And I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to just say it without sounding like I'm only saying it because you are leaving, but I love you, and I think I have for a long time, and I was too much of a coward to do the math on my own heart. It's not a perfect confession. It's messy, self-aware of its own inadequacy even as she's saying it, and I think that imperfection is exactly why it works, because a cleaner, more poetic declaration would have felt like the show cheating its way to catharsis. This one feels like it costs her something to say, like every word is being physically extracted from years of armor, and Elijah's reaction, and this is the part that genuinely got me, isn't relief, isn't immediate joy, it's caution. It's a man who has spent centuries being wanted only for what he could provide, finally being told he's loved, and not entirely trusting it, and he says, quietly, not cruelly, just honestly, how do I know this isn't gratitude wearing love's coat? And Christine doesn't have a perfect answer for that either, because there isn't one, and to the show's enormous credit, it doesn't manufacture one. She just says, you don't. Not tonight. Maybe not for a while. But I'd rather spend the time finding out than watch you walk out that door and never let either of us try. He doesn't unpack his suitcase that night. I want to be really clear about that because I think it's the single best choice the writers make in the entire final stretch. Because if he'd simply melted at her confession and stayed, it would have undercut every single thing the show had been building about the danger of leaping straight from realization to reconciliation without actually doing the work in between. Instead, he leaves that night, exactly as planned, into a rented apartment across the city, and the divorce paperwork, already filed, proceeds, and the marriage technically, legally ends, right on schedule, 5 years to the day. And here is where I think the show does its most emotionally sophisticated maneuver, because rather than treating the finalized divorce as a tragic ending, it reframes it as the actual beginning of something honest, because for the first time in 5 years, whatever happens between Christine and Elijah from that point forward is no longer obligated by a dying man's wish, a magical debt, or a 5-year clock ticking down in the background of every single interaction. They are, for the first time since they met, two free people who owe each other absolutely nothing, and the final stretch of episodes becomes, essentially, the story of them courting each other properly, slowly, without contracts or conditions, for what feels like the very first time. There's a gorgeous little sequence maybe 2 episodes from the end where Elijah, now living independently, awkwardly navigating an ordinary human bachelor apartment with mismatched furniture and a coffee maker he clearly doesn't fully understand yet, gets a knock at his door one evening, and it's Christine, holding takeout, visibly nervous in a way we have almost never seen her be, and she says, with this endearing, halting formality, I wasn't sure if you wanted company, but I thought, since we are not married anymore, this technically counts as a first date, and I've never actually been on one, so I might be bad at this. It's such a small, funny, human moment amid all this heavy thematic weight, and I have to give the show credit for knowing exactly when to let a little warmth and humor breathe after 4 seasons of near-constant emotional tension. Elijah, for his part, deadpans back, I've been alive for several thousand years and I've also never technically been on one, so we're evenly matched, and it's genuinely one of the few moments in the entire series that made me laugh out loud, because it's such a perfectly calibrated bit of dry chemistry between 2 actors who have spent the whole show communicating primarily through restraint, finally getting to be a little playful with each other. I want to briefly acknowledge, because I think it's a legitimate criticism some viewers have raised, that the pacing of this final stretch, the actual courtship after the divorce, moves faster than the 5 years of slow burn tension that preceded it, and there's a fair argument that the show could have used 1 or 2 more episodes to really let that rebuilding breathe before jumping toward its ending. I don't entirely disagree, honestly. There were a couple of scenes in this final act that felt slightly compressed, like the writers were aware they needed to land the plane within a certain episode count and had to speed up a process that, thematically, probably deserved a slower unspooling. It's the one place where I think the show's ambition slightly outpaces its runtime, and if I'm being a completely honest critic rather than just an enthusiastic one, that's a real, if minor, flaw worth naming rather than glossing over. That said, what the final does get unquestionably right is the way it handles Elijah's mortality, which the show had been quietly setting up thematically for a while without ever making it explicit until the very end. Because here's the thing that I think gets lost in a lot of casual conversation about this show. Elijah didn't just trade servitude for freedom, he traded immortality for it too. He is, for the first time in thousands of years, capable of actually dying, of aging, of getting sick, of experiencing every single one of the fragile, finite things that make human love so terrifying to commit to in the first place. There's a quietly beautiful scene near the very end where he notices a single grey hair at his temple in the bathroom mirror, the same bathroom mirror from that early, disorienting scene where he first stared at his own reflection, unable to process what being human even meant, and this time, instead of fear, there's this soft, almost amused acceptance on his face, and Christine, watching from the doorway, walks over, touches the grey hair gently, and says, "I like it. It means you are really here." It's a small gesture, but it's carrying the entire thematic weight of the show, because for a being who spent millennia outside of time, watching everyone he ever cared for age and die while he remained frozen and untouched, choosing to finally be mortal, finally be subject to the same fragile clock as the person he loves, is the single greatest act of commitment the show could possibly give him, bigger than any wedding, bigger than any declaration. The lamp itself gets one last, quiet scene that I think closes the loop beautifully. Christine, going through the last of the estate items now formerly hers, finds it again, and rather than locking it away or discarding it, she and Elijah take it together to the coast, to a beach the show has never shown us before, and in a moment scored with almost total silence except for waves and wind, they bury it in the sand, not destroy it, not display it, just quietly return it to the earth. A small private ritual acknowledging thousands of years of history without needing to erase or worship it. It's a lovely, understated visual metaphor for the way both of them are learning to hold their pasts, Christine's inherited grief and Elijah's inherited servitude, without either burning it down in denial or building a shrine to it in obsession. The very final scene of the series, and I'll describe it fully since we are doing full spoilers today, takes place roughly 8 months after the divorce was finalized, at a small, deliberately understated wedding. Nothing like the cold, transactional courthouse arrangement that opened this whole story, just a handful of people on that same beach where they buried the lamp, Priya standing beside Christine, Marcus, somewhat reformed and genuinely present, standing near the back. No press, no board members. No obligation of any kind pulling either of them into this moment except their own choice. Christine's woes are short, almost businesslike in structure, which the show clearly plays as an intentional character beat. She's still Christine, still precise, still a little awkward with big emotional language, but there's one line that undoes the whole audience, where she says, "The first time I married you, I didn't even know your name was a promise someone made for me. This time, it's the only promise I've ever actually chosen for myself." And Elijah, for his part, doesn't say anything grand or mystical either, just simply, "I spent 3,000 years being told what to want. This is the first thing I've ever wanted that no one gave me permission to." The show ends on a wide shot pulling back from the two of them on that beach, the sound of the ocean slowly swallowing their voices, the frame holding just long enough for you to feel the ending settle in your chest before the screen finally cuts to black. Now let's talk honestly about where this show sits for me overall, because I think it's earned a real, considered verdict rather than just breathless praise. I love this show, genuinely, unreservedly, and I say that as someone who watches an enormous volume of these romance dramas and has become fairly resistant to being moved by them, because I've simply seen too many recycled beats to be an easy mark anymore. What El Gran Poderoso Genio does that so many shows in this genre fail to do is trust its audience to sit in discomfort, to watch a marriage be genuinely, believably unhealthy for the majority of its runtime without rushing to soften it, without giving Christine premature redemption just to make viewers feel better sooner. That patience is rare, and it's exactly what makes the eventual payoff land as hard as it does, because you've earned the catharsis by sitting through real, uncomfortable dysfunction rather than a manufactured misunderstanding that gets cleared up in one convenient conversation. If I'm being fair about the show's weaker elements, beyond that slightly rushed final act pacing I mentioned, I do think the Nathaniel subplot, while thematically rich, occasionally borrows a little too heavily from familiar corporate drama beats, boardroom betrayals, shell company reveals, that sort of thing, and there are a couple of episodes in the middle stretch where the business plot mechanics slow down the emotional momentum rather than complementing it. I also think some viewers, particularly those coming in expecting a lighter, more conventional fantasy romance based on the marketing, are going to be legitimately frustrated by how long the show is willing to let Christine be genuinely unlikable before earning her arc, and I don't think that frustration is unreasonable, even if I personally think it's the correct storytelling choice. If you're a newcomer to this kind of drama, I think this show is a genuinely excellent entry point precisely because it takes its fantastical premise so seriously as emotional metaphor rather than pure spectacle. It never leans on its magic for cheap visual wow factor. It uses the genie concept almost entirely as a lens to examine loneliness, invisibility, and the terror of vulnerability, which makes it accessible even if you don't normally gravitate toward fantasy elements. If you're already a fan of slow burn, emotionally patient dramas, this is absolutely essential viewing, and I think it'll reward a rewatch even more than a first watch, because once you know about the journal, about the years of quiet sacrifice, every early scene of Christine's dismissiveness plays completely differently, heavier, sadder, more layered. And if you are coming at this from a more critical, structural viewpoint, I think there's a lot to admire in how deliberately the show constructs its visual and musical language around its central themes, even if the plotting occasionally leans on some familiar corporate drama scaffolding to hold up its more original emotional architecture. Who's going to dislike this show? Honestly, anyone looking for a breezy, low-stakes romantic comedy is going to find this far heavier and more melancholic than expected. This is not a show that's interested in easy, comfortable warmth. It earns its warmth through real discomfort first. If you have limited patience for slow burn pacing or want your leads kissing and resolved by episode 4, this will test you. And if secondhand emotional cruelty genuinely upsets you to watch, even when it's clearly building toward growth, some of those early and mid-season scenes, especially that dinner party moment, are going to sit uncomfortably with you, and that's fair, they're meant to. But for me, sitting here now, having watched the whole thing start to finish, what stays with me isn't the fantasy premise at all, it's that quiet, terrible, universal truth the show keeps circling back to, that the people who love us most patiently are so often the easiest to overlook, precisely because their love doesn't demand to be seen. This show made me want to go back through my own life and actually notice the folders left on my desk, so to speak, the quiet, undemanding kindnesses I've probably walked past without a second glance, and any piece of fiction that actually changes the way you pay attention to real people in your real life has done something genuinely worthwhile, fantasy premise or not. If this review helped you decide whether to watch El Gran Poderoso Genio, or if you've already seen it and you are sitting with all these same feelings I clearly can't stop talking about, drop a comment and let's talk about it properly. I genuinely want to know if you were Team Christine or Team Elijah during those brutal middle episodes, because I think that split says a lot about how each of us processes being loved quietly versus being loved loudly. If you enjoyed this deep dive, consider sticking around and subscribing to Jonota News. We've got a lot more of these full breakdowns coming, and honestly, this one's going to be hard to top, but we are going to try. Thanks for spending this much time in this story with me. It means a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.